So, this week is our third week in a short series looking at the stories of some of the women in the Bible who get overlooked, or their story is there, but we don't actually think about it very often or treat it as seriously as it deserves. They're not properly recognized. The story that we read today appears again in 2 Chronicles chapter 34. It's slightly different in the way it's written, but those are the only two mentions of Huldah in the entire Bible. In order to understand the story of Huldah, we have to understand the story of Israel at this point in their history. And you see that we're now long past the golden days of King David and Solomon after him. There's been fight after fight after fight, and the nation of Israel, the people of Israel, are split into two kingdoms. The north kingdom is 10 tribes, and that was Israel, and Judah is the 2 tribes in the south, and that included Jerusalem. But by this point in time, Israel has been taken into captivity. They thought they were safe, they thought they were secure. Does that sound familiar? They were comfortable where they were. And God said, judgment's coming. And they went, nah, be fine. And judgment came. And now Judah, having seen that, is doing the same. And Jeremiah is around at this time, and he is prophesying to the folks left in Israel and to Judah. So the Assyrians they had taken away the northern kingdom, but the southern kingdom, although it was left, when you read through Kings, you see king after king after king, and they're hopeless. Again, that sounds pretty like today. Do you know? King Manasseh had ruled for 55 years. That was the longest of any king in Judah's history. And the Bible tells us he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And then King Manasseh's son Amon followed right afterwards. And he was so bad, he was so evil, that his servants conspired to assassinate him after 2 years as king. It's pretty bad when your servants, who have a fairly privileged position, decide to bump you off. But one after another, what you get is, and he did evil in the sight of the Lord. And he did evil in the sight of the Lord. And then occasionally it says, and he did more evil than any other king. They were a dreadful shower. And so here we are. They bump Ammon off, and we're left with an 8-year-old, Josiah. Now, I don't know about you, but if you know any 8-year-olds, you probably would not choose them to be king. Do you know? What would you like to do today? I would like to play, and I would like trifle. Right? No, we're not going to do that. We would choose not to do that. However, in those days, actually, it happened quite often. Because what really happened was that the advisors ran the kingdom in the name of the child. In the ancient world, kings and queens were often very young. But they weren't allowed to cause the kind of havoc you might expect. Most of the administration was in the hands of the mother or the servants. And so for us, the question is, how is Josiah, at 8 years old, going to turn out? Well, in our reading today, it simply said he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. But in 2 Chronicles, it gives us a little bit more information. So in chapter 34, verses 3 to 7, it says this: in the 8th year of his reign, while he was still young, 16 he would be at that point, fairly young, he began to seek the God of his father David. Now, obviously, David was not really his father, but his ancestor, his father in faith, if you like. In his 12th year, he began to purge Judah and Jerusalem of high places, Asherah poles, and idols. So when the Israelites came into the promised land, there were already people living there, and they worshipped other gods. And as time went on, the Israelites began also to worship these gods, and where they worshipped God, they also put in idols Asherah poles, and they worshipped these other local gods along with God. And so here's the beginning of taking them down. He cut to pieces the incense altars that were above them and smashed the Asherah poles and the idols. These he broke to pieces and scattered over the graves of those who had sacrificed to them. And the idea of putting the stuff over the graves, and later it talks about burning the bones of some of the priests. They didn't kill them to burn the bones. These were people who were already dead. But the thought was that made them so bad that they couldn't be used again in any sense, because the bones of the dead had been mixed with them. He burned the bones of the priests and their altars, and he purged Judah and Jerusalem. In the towns of Manasseh, Ephraim, and Simeon, as far as Naphtali and the ruins around them, he tore down the altars and the Asherah poles and crushed the idols to powder and cut to pieces all the incense altars throughout Israel. And then he went back to Jerusalem. So, over the years, the kings of Judah had ignored the temple, and it had fallen into disrepair. And so Josiah decided to get things spruced up. You know what it's like. You think, oh, it's looking fine, and you leave it, and then you get a drip. And so they started working on the building. And isn't it interesting that they trusted the workmen? They didn't ask them to make lists of what they needed. They just gave them the money and said, there you go, fix it. Because they were trustworthy people, and they trusted them. Suddenly, though, word comes from the priest Hilkiah that he's found the book of the law of the Lord given through Moses. Now, we don't actually know what that book was. Some people think it's a copy of Deuteronomy, and others think it's the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, but we don't actually know. But how on earth they had managed to lose this book, this really important book, is another question altogether. But I think it shows something of how far they had gone from God. When here's this book and it's found in a pile of old rubbish in the temple. However, when the book was brought to King Josiah, he did what I think most of us would do if you found a great ancient book found buried like a treasure in a pile of rubbish. He read it. Seems pretty reasonable. It wouldn't have taken a genius to understand that the Israelites were living very far from God. And so as soon as Josiah finished the reading of the book, he began to tear his clothes in distress, because he realized that when God said, if you do this, I will bless you, but if you do this, judgment is coming. He realized they were doing the thing that was going to bring judgment. And so because he was looking for God and wanted God in his life, he was afraid. He was so serious about following God that he realized how far short both he and his nation were from living according to God's plan and purpose. So he's already been at work trying to reform the kingdom and to get them back on track with God. But now he just realized how much more needed to be done. And it seems that King Josiah was not really comfortable proceeding on his own without advice of a spiritual insider, so to speak. So he decides to call on a prophet who can give him the word of God and tell him what will happen to the kingdom because of their waywardness. And as I said earlier, there was a prophet at that time, and he's got a great big long book in the Bible. His name was Jeremiah. Very well known. Bit of a troublemaker, actually, if the truth were to be told. But there's another prophet, and her name is Huldah. So Josiah gives his servants instructions that they are to go and ask the Lord on my behalf, and on behalf of those who still remain in Israel, that Judah, concerning the contents of the scroll that has been found. So Hilkiah and the royal officials went to find somebody they knew would bring God's word. And they went to Huldah. It doesn't tell us much about her at all, except that she was married to Shallum and lived in Jerusalem's second district. But at this point in Israel's history, clearly a really important point. While Judah is looking for a way forward and following God, it's her they choose to go to hear from God. I don't think I have to remind you that in those days, women weren't really considered of great value. They had the babies, they fetched the water, they cooked the meals, they kept the house, they did that kind of stuff, but they weren't really found in the royal courts. They weren't expected to be teachers in synagogues. They weren't allowed to be teachers in synagogues because that was a man's place. And so it's interesting that instead of going to this man who was the prophet, they chose to go to this woman, Huldah. She was the wife of the keeper of the wardrobe. A great title. The wife of the keeper of the wardrobe. Maybe she shared in that work. Maybe she was a seamstress. We don't know. All we know is that she was married to him and there was a wardrobe and that lived in the second quarter in Jerusalem. It seems that nothing else about her is that important. But what we do know is that the king's secretary and the high priest knew somehow that God was with her and that God spoke through her. We don't know how they knew. We're not told that. Maybe, like Jeremiah, she had been warning the people for years that judgment was coming. Or maybe it was something much more subtle than that. Maybe it was something that you felt when you were in her presence. Maybe it was something about her character. We simply don't know. But they knew that she was the person to go to hear from God. And if you have that strong connection with God, it can only mean that you are a person of faith. So we can conclude that even as everybody else around her was worshipping these false gods, Huldah had remained faithful to the one true God. She was not swayed by popular practice or opinion, nor by promptings or urgings from her neighbors or her friends. Here was somebody who was faithful. Here was somebody who was trustworthy. Kings and their royal counselors don't just go to anybody for advice. They go to somebody they know they can trust. And so it says a lot about her, that these two men realized that the best way to know what God wanted to say to the nation was to go to Huldah. We don't actually know how she got her message from God. It doesn't tell us. We don't know how long it took for her to get her message from God. It doesn't tell us. But what we do know, because it does tell us, is that she got a message from God. And she passed it on. But what courage it must have taken for her and for prophets in the Old Testament who had that message of judgment from God. Her message is that judgment is coming because the people have turned away from him, because they've forsaken him, and they've gone to worship these other gods that are no gods at all. How much pressure must there have been on her to say, do you know what? It'll be fine. It'll be all right. You've got the book now. You'll be fine. But she says what God gives her to say. This faithful, godly woman speaks this message that is one of judgment. But she also has a message, a personal message for the king. Because he responded to the message of the law in humility, the disaster that is going to come upon the people is not going to be in his time. He's not going to see it. It's going to be after him. So here's the message. And they brought it to the king. And the effect is seen in the next chapter. In 2 Kings 23, it begins. Then the king called together all the elders of Judah and Jerusalem. He went up to the temple of the Lord with the people of Judah, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the priests and the prophets, all the people from the least to the greatest. He read in their hearing all the words of the book of the covenant which had been found in the temple of the Lord. The king stood by the pillar and renewed the covenant in the presence of the Lord, to follow the Lord, to keep his commands, his statutes and decrees with all of his heart and all of his soul, thus confirming the words of the covenant written in the book. And then all the people pledged themselves to the covenant. So you might be asking, what on earth has this got to do with us in 2019? We haven't lost the Bible. We know where it is. Most of us have one at home. And if you don't have one at home, you could probably go to a shop and buy one. And you could buy one in any number of translations. Or if you have a phone that does it, you can get an app. And you can have loads of translations on your phone. We haven't lost the Bible. We know exactly where it is. But there are two things we need to be wary of with that type of thinking. I have a fishing rod in my cupboard. It's not lost. I know exactly where it is. But I never go fishing. There's no circumstance under which I could call myself a fisherman. But it's not lost. I can take you to where it is if you come home with me. Having multiple copies of the Bible means nothing if I don't read it. If I don't expect to learn about God when I do read it. And to hear from God. Equally, I might read it regularly. I might be very faithful in reading it. But maybe I choose to ignore the bits that I don't like. The bits that don't fit in with my personal preference. Maybe I want to just change these wee bits because, well, we don't do that nowadays. That's not what the culture says. And so we change it to make it fit us. But actually, we're meant to change to fit it because it's God's word. Bringing God's plans and God's purposes. And so, by ignoring it, or by trying to change it and make it fit us, it might as well be lost. And we need to get it back. Isn't it interesting that the word was only found after Josiah started to seek God? It's not that it was found and then he looked for God. He was looking for God. And then when he was ready to lead the people forward, they found this word that changed everything. So I think when people actively seek God, God gives them a hunger for his word. Gives them a passion to know him, to understand him. And we find out about him in his word. Yes, we speak to him and he speaks to us in prayer and through prophecy, but actually the main place to learn about God is in his word. That's where we learn his story, the stories of his people, his plans for us. It's where we get hope for the future. And I think today we need more people like Huldah who have that deep personal relationship with God, who are able to speak truth into the life of the church today and into our communities today. People who are trustworthy and reliable, who are unafraid to bring challenging words as well as words of encouragement. And I don't say that simply because it's in the Old Testament, just in case you're wondering. Although the Old Testament is very important. I think I've said that once before. 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verses 1 to 5. Follow the way of love and eagerly desire gifts of the Spirit, especially prophecy. For anyone who speaks in a tongue does not speak to people but to God. Indeed, no one understands them. They utter mysteries by the Spirit, but the one who prophesies speaks to people for their strengthening, encouraging, and comfort. Anyone who speaks in a tongue edifies themselves, but the one who prophesies edifies the whole church. I would like every one of you to speak in tongues, but I would rather have you prophesy. Prophecy is not just something for the Old Testament. It's for now. God gives gifts to his people that are to strengthen, to encourage, to build up. And part of that strengthening is bringing that word of challenge, because it's in the challenge that we grow in faith. I think there are people here today who, in their relationship with God, hear from God, but actually sometimes don't pass on the message that God has for his people. And I think we all miss out as a result of that. And so I want to encourage you, as Paul does, to eagerly desire to follow the way of love and eagerly desire the gifts of the Spirit, especially that gift of prophecy. That's hearing from God, whether it's through his word or in prayer, through your relationship with him, and then bringing it to the people of God. Prophecy comes through God's people listening to God and speaking words that strengthen, encourage, and comfort. We need people like Huldah, men and women, who listen to God and who are not afraid to speak God's words to God's people.